Martha Christina Clemson was born in Denmark, May 7th, 1822, in Jehindo, Thisted County, Denmark. Her father was Clement Nielsen Dahl and her mother was Maren Christensen. Martha was the second child. A brother was older. When she was only 9 years old, Martha's father died, leaving his wife with 6 small children to raise. The finances of the family made it impossible for the mother to keep all her family, so she had to let the older ones go out for work. The boys had to apprentice to a tradesman. Martha's mother signed the papers for Martha to go work for a well-to-do man who lived on the other side of the island. He would keep Martha for 7 years under the agreement. One must wonder what went through the mother's mind as she sent her daughter off, maybe never to see her again. Time passed, and Martha stayed much longer than the 7 years. In fact, she never returned home to live again until she joined the church when she was grown. On the big farm where Martha went to live, her first job was to tender the ducks and geese. There were lots of them, and they had to be carefully kept because there was such a demand for the feathers and bedding. Martha was only one of many servants. She was often homesick, but she knew that she couldn't go home because her father was dead and her mother could not support her. We complain about going without things today, but we've never had to give up our children because we couldn't feed them. I hope we never know such hard times as they had then. As soon as Martha was old enough, she went into the fields to bind grain. One day, all day long she followed the reapers and bound grain by hand. Early in the morning and late at night, before and after going into the fields to work, the women had to milk the cows, fix the meals, do the housework, and look after the butter and cream. The men considered it beneath them to milk the cows or have any work or chores around the house. The women did this in addition to their work in the fields. Martha was never idle. She would sit in bed long after the others went to sleep to knit in the dark. It was too cold to stay up and knit, so she would go into bed most of the time to keep warm. She learned to knit so well that she made all her sweaters and stockings in bed. For her wages, Martha received the wool from 2 sheep a year to use for clothes. She had to cord and spin and knit all the wool herself. She received her board and room and $8 a year salary. Of course, she saved most of her money. Some of it she gave to her mother. Her mother had to furnish her 1 pair of wooden shoes a year. They were very comfortable and warm and didn't get cold and wet in the snow. I know, for I wore wooden shoes all the time when I was a girl. Father made them for us. Each person was required by the law to keep a record book when they started work. Wherever the person went, the Lord they worked for would write in the book what they had done, how good they worked, and how they had behaved. The Lord, whom Martha worked for, was a mean person. If he didn't like the workers, he wouldn't write anything good in their books, and they were forced to stay and work for him because no one else would hire them. Martha stayed on longer, as she knew what her records would say if she tried to go anywhere else. Mette was Martha's younger sister, and when she was old enough to go out to work, she wanted to go where Martha was. She knew the work was hard and long, and the master was cruel, but Mette thought she could stand these hardships better than to go someplace alone. Martha was glad when Mette came. She had been lonesome. Now she had one of her very own family with her. She did everything she could to make things easier for her sister in the field because Mette was not very strong. Martha often did her own work and much of Mette's as she could. Mette couldn't quite keep up with the others when they were cradling the grain. Each man who cradled had a binder who was a woman. The woman followed the man and bound the grain into the sheaves. One day, Mette had an extra hard time keeping up. She kept getting further and further behind. Finally, she was a whole round behind the cutter. When the man who was cutting saw how far behind Mette was, he started teasing her and acting smart. They used big, long scythes to cut the grain, and he would try to see how close he could swing to Mette as he was cutting the next round and came to where she was still tying. Each time he would cut a little closer to her legs, laughing. Then he slipped, and the blade of the scythe caught Mette across the thigh. Blood just poured out. One man picked her up and carried her on his back to the house, but the cut was too deep and Mette bled to death before they could do anything for her. It was harvest time, and the Lord couldn't stop at the death of one woman. There was plenty more work in her place, plenty more to work in her place. If they weren't able to do that, they weren't worth bothering with. Martha could only stand helplessly by and watch her little sister die. This was the greatest sorrow of her life. And though she lived to be an old woman, she never ceased to grieve for her little sister, whose death seemed so unnecessary and cruel. Even then, Martha remained at the same place. She had to go right on working through the thoughtless lord of the farm, and also with the worker who had killed her sister. Martha stayed there until the missionaries came to Denmark, and she heard them preach the gospel. Then she knew that there was a better way to live. She believed what they taught and was ready to join the church. Martha's mother, Maren Clemson, was the first person on the island where she lived to join the church. 3 of her children were baptized, but 2 of her daughters never did join the church. Martha came home from the farm where she had been working, and the family got ready to sail to America. Her mother felt sad to think her other daughters were not joining them, but she had a very strong testimony of the gospel and knew that they would find a better way of life than they had here. Martha, her mother, her brother, and her sister sailed for America in a sailing ship, the Cambria, in 1854.